So friends or foes, and what does it all mean politically? Let's turn to a special panel to find out. The host of the Curse of Politics podcast, David Herle, is with us tonight from Toronto, as is Kory Teneycke. And new panelist Jordan Leichnitz is with me here in Ottawa. Scott Reed is also part of the podcast. The prompter says he's not with us today. That doesn't sound right, guys. He's contracted to another network, so he can't be with us today, but we sure would have him if that were the case. So hello to Scott. He's still alive and well. But welcome to all three of you. It's great to have you with us tonight. I wanted to start off in this topic because all of you have a lot of experience, obviously, within Ontario politics. David, I'll throw the first question to you. This week is sort of interesting in that we've got them standing shoulder to shoulder publicly, and then some kind of peek behind the curtain show maybe not as much. What do you think of the back and forth between the Premier and the Prime Minister on the Emergencies Act issue? And do you think it's in the Premier's interest to kind of stay out of the political fray of it right now?
Probably less so now, but I think at that time, they might have, the Ford government might not have been certain about what the politics of the convoy was. I mean, COVID was exceptionally difficult for Conservative parties, as we know. There wasn't a lot of anger about lockdowns in Ontario, but there was some. And there weren't a lot of convoy supporters in Ontario, but there were some. And those people tended to be supporters of the Conservative Party. And I think the Ford government realized early on that Ontario was different than Alberta or Saskatchewan, and they pretty much mirrored federal policies on COVID. But when it came to the convoy, I think that early on, at least, they probably thought that it was better for them to stay away from it than it was for them to get involved one way or another.
Do you think that's true, Kory? I mean, and I can ask you very directly because you were in the mix at the time. And then do you think the calculation politically is a different one now, should the Premier be asked? I should say, he says he hasn't been asked by the inquiry to testify.
Well, I think the situation was very different, in fact. I think that at the core of these hearings and at core of what the situation was at the time is that the police were not doing their job. This is a failure of policing. There were convoys that went to Toronto, I think 3 times over the course of that period, and they were removed from the city in the same day. So we had a number of examples of policing done properly in other jurisdictions, including Toronto, and then we had one example of policing done terribly, and that was in Ottawa, where protests became an occupation and went on for weeks. Was an inappropriate situation, but it's not for the Premier of the province to direct police any more than it is for any other politician. Maybe there should be more latitude given for politicians to direct the police than there is currently. I think there's an argument to be made for that, but it's not for the Premier of the province any more than it is for the Prime Minister or the Mayor to tell the police how to operationally conduct themselves. But I do think it's reasonable to expect that the police are going to enforce the law and end an illegal blockade that goes on for weeks. And they quite simply didn't do it. And I think that's what you're going to see more and more as these hearings progress.
The question, though, Jordan, about the fact that the police, or the consternation over whether the police were doing their job, is what steps in the absence of that, right? And that is part of what the inquiry is focusing on. And that is where the question around whether or not the province needs to be heard from more. And my original question to Kory is kind of about the politics of it. Is there less potential damage to the Premier by speaking out on this stuff now, or than there would have been, as David pointed out, or at least risk, as David pointed out earlier on?
Yeah, I mean, I think things have changed now for sure. I mean, you have to remember at the time, too, the conflict that was happening and what was also happening at the Windsor border crossing was really where a lot of the focus was for the Premier. So I think quite rightly, that was where he was looking politically in order to get that unblocked because of the trade issues. What's happening right now with the inquiry, nobody's covering themselves in glory here. There's more than enough blame to go around. And I do think that there is a problem, though, because now we're seeing a pattern where Ford was asked, and representatives were asked to participate in meetings, and they didn't. They said that they were sending a certain number of OPP officers, and they weren't. So there's a lot of unanswered questions there. I think he would be smart to stay away from testifying if he can, but I don't know if that's going to be tenable.
Well, and the Prime Minister avoided directly answering today when asked about that, right? Should Ford have done more? Like, what were you saying when you were saying he was hiding from responsibility? He did not say, well, here's what I meant by it. He sort of said, at the end of the day, we stood next to each other, and that's where it kind of ends for me. I have another political question for you, David, because my colleague Catherine Cullen had a really interesting piece about how federal Conservatives are teed off, actually, at the degree to which Doug Ford, the Premier, is publicly supporting the Prime Minister on this issue, and how unequivocal he was a few days ago in saying, I stand shoulder to shoulder. He should have invoked the Emergencies Act. What do you think of that kind of cleavage between, what many say is the country's most powerful Conservative and the federal Conservatives?
Well, Doug Ford's an interesting cat. I mean, he goes out of his way to, first of all, a lot of Conservatives in the Conservative movement are unhappy with him because of things like his rapprochement with the labor movement, or at least the private sector labor movement, and working with people that have traditionally not been part of the Conservative tent. He's trying to broaden that tent in some interesting ways. And there are Conservatives who don't like that. Second of all, he and Trudeau have a complete public non-aggression pact, and I commented on Mr. Trudeau's part of it going into the provincial election, where I thought he did Mr. Ford a lot of favors at the expense of the provincial Liberal Party going into the provincial election. And I imagine that federal Conservatives are angry that Mr. Trudeau gets the endorsement of Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford the other day said, "Party labels, I hate them." Well, that's, if you're a Conservative activist, that's an interesting message to hear. So he's a Premier that wants to have as much support personally as he possibly can. I think he's fairly ambivalent about the PC Party or the Conservative Party, to be honest.
What do you think of the dynamic there, Kory? And it is interesting, I think, for our audience as well, because we cover so much of what goes on in Alberta and Saskatchewan, for example, and how vocal the Conservative premiers there are in opposing Justin Trudeau. You just don't, obviously you have a different voting base in Ontario, but you just don't get the same sentiment from Premier Ford.
Well, a fifth of his vote came from people who voted for the federal Liberal Party, and that's why he has the largest majority going, in this province for a Conservative going back several generations. That's why he won seats like Windsor that haven't been Conservative in 50 years. So I don't think it's for Doug Ford to make any explanation to unnamed Conservative MP backbenchers who have been quite unsuccessful electorally in the last number of elections. I think they would be better to emulate the approach of trying to broaden the coalition and to focus on larger issues, which I think they are, like the economy. That's where the votes are. There aren't votes for the Conservative Party. There's no path to victory for the Conservative Party talking about the Convoy and looking in the rear view mirror at pandemic policy. There are a lot of votes talking about inflation and the cost of living and a looming recession. And that's why I think you see Pierre Poilievre focusing on those things. So a bit of nattering from the backbenches is not something that I think is of a particular note.
Last word to you, Jordan.
Yeah, well, I think that Pierre Poilievre will be lucky if his MPs manage to resist the temptation to weigh in on the Convoy. Every day that they can hold back from doing that is a good day for them.
Okay, on that note, thanks everyone. Best of luck with the curse of politics. As always, we're listening. I know our audience is too. David Herle, Kory Teneycke, and Jordan Leichnitz. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.